Should we trust scientists? Is democracy the only moral system of government? And if COVID was worse, would vaccine mandates be justified? We'll answer these questions and more on today's episode of Good Take, Bad Take. Hey friends, welcome to this episode of the Good Take, Bad Take podcast. This is the podcast where we gather takes from all across the internet that we find interesting, and we give our opinion on whether we think they are good or bad. My name is Britt, and I'm here with my co-host Donnie. And before we get started, make sure to like, share, subscribe, comment. All that stuff helps us out. You can find us on Instagram at Good Take, Bad Take Pod, and on Twitter on YouTube at Good Bad Take Pod. And without further ado, let's get into some of these takes. So the first one of today comes from Scott Adams. And he tweets out, the quote, 98% of scientists agree, unquote, belief is manufactured by a system that financially rewards alarm and punishes non-alarm. The 98% illusion works because humans are unaware of how corrupt scientists are, and the public does not understand that, quote, follow the science works every time. But I think the pandemic woke us up. Now you can see the machinery of the fraud. It's all as clear as the Biden crime family, which means CNN will ignore it. What do you think?
Quick correction. He does say follow the money, not follow the science.
Oh, sorry. Follow the money. My bad.
Yeah, you're just so used to hearing
I was
follow
just,
the science.
Yeah.
But I mean, I guess it's the same. Well, I'm surprised to see this from Scott Adams. I think it's a good take. I'm skeptical of it because a couple months ago, maybe half a year or a year, he was being very obtuse and obstinate on people who were doubting the narratives of the 98% of scientists. So I don't know if then he was trying to do something tricky or now he's trying to do something tricky. I'm pretty sure we talked about on one of our episodes his exchange with Dave Smith on this.
How could we know was his thing? Is like, well, how did you know? Was it just a shot in the dark or did you actually have a reason for knowing?
That's right. And he answers himself here, which is to say that, everyone who was saying that you have to take this and you have to know, we're relying on the appeal to authority of the 98% of scientists agree. Whereas the entire argument that Dave and people like us were making is that the whole consensus starts from the false premise that the people who are this consensus are reliable, good actors. And so it's very weird to see him. I don't know if if he was being weird then to play devil's advocate, if he's trying to play devil's advocate now, or what is going on, but he's essentially answered his own question and objection, which is laying out very clearly that when you follow the money, when you understand that, as Michael Malice will describe being red-pilled, that there is an orchestrated narrative that is being fed to you in order to deceive you, and that there is an intentional disruption of facts and an intentional guiding of what you should or shouldn't think that is contrary to the plain truth, then it makes sense that everything regarding COVID and vaccines and stuff would be you should be skeptical of, and you shouldn't just buy in. And so the 98% claim doesn't really hold a lot of water, because that'd be like saying, I don't know, 98% of street vendors on China are going to sell you a Rolex watch. And it's like, yeah, but a lot of street vendors and these places are going to be selling fakes to begin with, and you shouldn't be skeptical. And it doesn't matter if they're assuring you that their product is genuine. You already have the knowledge that a lot of these people are looking to scam you. And so in the same way, 98% of scientists agree. All these government agents agree. It doesn't matter, because all of that is built on a premise that these institutions are objective and they have no bias and they have no ulterior motive to get you to believe this, which is just clearly not the case.
I know it's always funny to me that the left, who used to be so anti-pharmaceutical, so very much paranoid, and I think rightfully so, over vested interest in the private sector in terms of influencing how pharmaceuticals are built or how real estate or anything that is important is done, and their influence on it, and the money will corrupt it. Like, they, for whatever reason, in the past few years, have just totally flipped on that, and now it's like, oh no, we just have to trust them. And maybe I've talked about this before on this podcast, but my wife and I are having a kid here soon, and we were reviewing the vaccine schedule. And one of the vaccines that they give right after a kid comes out is, they give 2 shots that are supposed to occur right after the kid is born. First is vitamin K, and there's some debate, on that, but on both like the 98% and other people, what the dosage should be and whether it should be administered. But it's vitamin K, right? And it maybe the type of vitamin K or the type of shot that you get with that can change whether it's good or not. But then the second one is the hepatitis B vaccine. And if you know anything about hepatitis B, the only way you get it is either through intimate contact of the adult kind with another adult, or through intravenous drug usage with a needle. So those are the two ways that you get hepatitis B. Or you can get it if you're a kid and you come out and your mother that birthed you has hepatitis B as well. What's funny about it, though, is that they test for hepatitis B in the mother weeks before, several times throughout the pregnancy to make sure she doesn't have that. So they know when she goes into the hospital that she doesn't have hepatitis B. So I asked our, care provider, I said, hey, can you tell me why? I'm just not understanding why we need to have hepatitis B on the vaccine schedule when our little daughter comes out. And the nurse lady that was checking in was like, well, it's on the CDC schedule, So I was like, okay, I'll figure I'll ask, the primary care provider doctor about this. Same answer. It's on the CDC schedule. That's what it should be. I said, well, it just doesn't make any sense. And the lady was kind of irritated, that we were asking about this. But it's like, well, if you can't give me a good answer, why am I depending on you? You are the expert. You're supposed to give me an answer that works. So anyways, I dug into it more. So now I know why they give the hepatitis B. And it's not a good reason. It's that in the 1980s and the 1970s, when there's a lot of Hep B going around, sometimes women would lie about their status and they wouldn't get tested. And so they were just giving the hepatitis B shot to kids because it's like, well, it's just better safe than sorry. That doesn't apply anymore, right? So it's kind of like that whole analogy of, the daughter asks the mother, why do you cut the ends off of the ham? And the mother says, well, it makes it more moist, and better flavor. And then, I think that's what it is at least. And then she asks her mom and so on and so forth until they get to the great grandmother. And the great grandmother's like, well, I cut the ends off the ham because I didn't have a big enough pan to fit it in to cook. It's like, oh, okay, the original reason was lost. And the original reason wasn't even that good in the first place necessarily because it didn't apply to everyone. But that's how a lot of the medical community goes. They're not actually people that are curious. They're people that perform jobs. And they've been given the status of, well, they are the experts and they know. But it's like an expert is supposed to be challenging current assumptions and have good reasons and arguments to back up why they believe what they believe. Unfortunately, they don't. Thankfully, the pandemic, like Scott Adams is saying, and maybe this is true for him, it woke us all up to that reality because we saw experts saying things that didn't make sense that they couldn't back up.
Yeah, I think that's just a good illustration in general how it feels like we have a society that encourages being curious and exploring and doing your own thing, except on the things that matter. It's a very weird juxtaposition. We're not, because I think the common perception through media and general pop culture that I've seen anyway has been, Christian or generally traditional families are very close-minded, and they say you have to submit to the authority of your father. You don't get to question why you believe your beliefs and all these kinds of things. That seems very much what they tell you. Our families like that are traditional are like. I know that there are definitely some families and cultures that are like that, and I don't think that that's great. But more and more, the general cultural feel isn't that you should be questioning the right or questioning all things and all authorities. You shouldn't be questioning the idea of democracy. You shouldn't be questioning even like something that's like, I don't necessarily believe in, like the results of the election through voter fraud specifically, right? Like, you're not supposed to question these things. You're not supposed to ask and be curious and open-minded. You're supposed to submit to the authority. And so it's the sort of the iron law of woke projection on that cultural level that's been you've been sort of gaslit your entire life to believe that, it's the other people, it's the traditionalists that are closed-minded and don't want you questioning authority. And the only reason why you would ever want to question the authorities that I'm appealing to is because you're a crazy person, you're a conspiracy theorist. It's not that you can't question. It's just, if you do, we're going to mock you and ridicule you and laugh you out of the court of public opinion. And so that you don't end up questioning it. It's kind of the same way where the government will encourage restrictions on speech through private actors, where they can't legally act. They will have their big corporations carry it out for them. In the same way, they're not going to tell you don't question the government outright. They're not going to say you know there's a law that you can't, like John Adams say, you can't criticize the US government, no laws like that anymore. But instead, the culture is such that it takes care of it for them. And so, all this being said, it's a very interesting juxtaposition of what you're being told. Usually people who are thinking outside the box, what people from different backgrounds come from, those people are being told, oh, you're ridiculous, you're crazy. But also they're the ones that are being painted always as they're never allowed to question authority in their own homes, and you shouldn't be raised that way to think that way, when really in many cases they're the ones who are open-minded and questioning things, and not following the trodden path per se.
That's a really good point about how open-mindedness no longer means what it actually means, which is curiosity and trying to understand every perspective on it. And I would say that you don't actually disagree, or you have the inability to disagree and argue with someone unless you fully understand their position and the argument that they're making to support it. And that's, to me, what open-mindedness is. Somehow, though, we've substituted it, or our culture in general has substituted it to mean like, well, you need to be accepting of other lifestyles, not necessarily, and not even like thinking critically about it, like understanding it, but accepting it. That's what open-minded means. It doesn't mean that you can understand it. So I really liked your distinction on that. And, all scientific achievements, scientific theories that have, changed the world, all at some point went against the public consensus, whether it is the way that whether the earth or the sun revolved around each other, to the theories of gravity, like all of these things are things that upset the status quo, that disagreed with the vast majority. And in earlier times, you could be killed for having those opinions. Today, I guess in some places you can still be, but most of the time it's just public assassination, essentially. But yeah, it's funny how far we've gotten away from that spirit, which I think was pretty intrinsic to just America in general. And one of the things that made us really special is that, like, hey, why can't we do this? Why can't we set up a government that is not like England? Why can't we just have a totally free market? And the entrepreneurial spirit and the scientific spirit and innovation are getting squashed out of us, and now we're starting to see the fallout of it.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think I've probably given this example at least once, if not more times, but the Overton window of what is and isn't acceptable is always shrinking, and so that what you're allowed to disagree on is always within the scope of what they want. I can't remember the exact who said the quote about that the major parties want you arguing very furiously within a very small window of debate, right? Like, they want you focused on, you can't expand the dialogue. And no, like I was saying, I've probably given this example before, but nowhere's that clearer to me than when I was in debate at university, which is, again, supposed to be probably the pinnacle of open-mindedness, understanding other sides of the arguments. We were in a debate format that specifically you got assigned randomly onto which side you were on a topic. You wouldn't know which topics you were getting until 15 minutes beforehand. So not only did you have to prepare to be on a side of a debate you didn't know, you had to know all the sides of all the current issues and all the current debates ahead of time. So it was, you had to know a lot. You had to think critically and clearly. However, the Overton window was such that when it came to abortion, the debate was not, is abortion moral, or is abortion justified in some scenarios or not justified in others? The debate was, should abortion be government subsidized or not? That was the Overton window of allowable opinion. And that, to me, was very much, I knew how lefty and how, generally progressive that scene was, but that really opened my eyes to, wow, okay, this is not an open-minded society of people. And the interesting thing is, I've seen a lot of people justify their view through this idea and phrase. I remember seeing it on the show. Oh, what's it called? It was an HBO show. I want to say it was called The Newsroom. And they sort of preach this idea that, there's not two sides to every issue. That's bullcrap. You don't have to do a pro and con for every single side. And what's interesting about this is I've kind of gone back and forth in this in my mind, because I've thought about it. And to me, it's like, well, there are some things that are so heinous and reprehensive that I'm inclined to say and think that. But then I realized that the sort of trick that using that phrase in this context is actually there is multiple sides to every story. But when you don't have to believe that all sides are moral to engage with. And that's the key issue, because then the news or the media or the public culture or whatever starts going into this nebulous morality that they haven't defined and will change on a whim. And so then they can say, well, there's not two sides to every story because of an arbitrary morality that we have not defined, that we are currently shifting and changing. So whereas, even 10 years ago, 5 years ago, having a debate about whether or not allowing your child to opt into puberty blockers on their own is a moral thing or not, like, of course that was within the realm of debate, and if anything, it was almost unthinkable that anyone would argue in favor of it. The tide is now shift because they've changed the rules of morality, and they'll say, well, there's no side. We don't have to represent both sides. There's not two sides to every issue. It's just wrong if you're trying to take away, parental rights or kids' rights or whatever you want to say to change it. But that's the conflation they do. And so that COVID very much mirrored that. And that's what Scott Adams highlights here in many ways. He doesn't bring up that moral element, but we all felt it, right? Where if there aren't two sides to COVID. Either you're moral and you want to save people, or and that's it.
Or
otherwise, you're an evil person.
Yep.
And there's no two sides to that, because it's moral versus immoral. Instead of looking at, there are multiple sides, and being moral, depending on your perception, actually can be argued from both sides. There definitely are. You're just holding there's no two sides to your perspective, which is the complete antithesis and opposite of trying to investigate multiple angles of a story or an idea.
Very well said. All right, moving on to our next one. We've got a quote retweet by Joshua Reed Eagle, and he's quote retweeting Project Liberal, which I'm pretty sure he's a part of in some way or adjacent to. And they've got it's a meme of a goose, and someone says, "Democracy is mob rule and needs to be abolished." And then the goose says, "Replace it with what?" And then the goose chases after the person saying, "Replace it with what?" And Joshua Eagle retweets it saying, "Next time someone tells you they hate democracy, ask them to articulate the alternative," implying that no one that dislikes democracy has a better alternative. What do you think?
I'd say this guy obviously hasn't read Bryan Caplan. He's not even my favorite, but Bryan Caplan has articulated so much of how privatized everything would work to degrees that you didn't even think. And for those of you who don't know, Kaplan runs, like a free education thing that you can take yourself, and it's an absolutely free education thing, which is great. But there's plenty of systems that talk about how privatized interactions would work better. How there's all kinds of solutions that would work in our to replace individual systems, but I think what makes me more irritated about this is this gives me the same energy where when you hear someone say, "If you don't vote, you don't get to complain." And to me, that's always such an absurd notion, because if something bad is happening and you could have done something to stop it, yeah, like you definitely should have. And I think voting is even less that way, especially when you're talking about a single person. But it's like, I can still complain about an injustice or an immorality or a bad thing, regardless of my action. I can be the biggest hypocrite in the world, and bad thing is still bad, right?
Yes.
My contingency has nothing to do with it. But, I do think, like I was saying, Bryan Caplan and Tom Woods, and there's all kinds of people who have argued for ways you can create an anarchist society that would actually be very functional and beneficial. But you can still think, even if you said, I don't know what we'd replace it with, you can still say democracy is mob rule and should be abolished, and we should figure something out. You can still say that and recognize that it's, and not have the perfect solution and recognize it's wrong. It'd be akin to saying, I don't like the way that our legal system handles drug offenders. And even if you're not for full legalization, saying, "Oh, okay, so what? What would you replace it with?" And it's like, you don't have to have a exact legal framework, and you don't have to be a textbook lawyer to say that maybe we should change some things in society. And it's just an unfair burden to say, "Hey, we should abolish this thing," and then someone's saying, "And replace it with what?" And you have to have the exact framework and definition. I don't think that you have to. I think it's helpful, and I think there's plenty of resources out there. But to me, I think you're just also, it shows more that you can't defend the immorality of democracy, unless you are willing to say, yeah, it actually is. It is mob rule, and it's not great, but I think it's the least bad system, which is a more, it's a better position to hold. And a lot of people do hold that. But I don't think Josh Reed Eagle would even say that it's mob rule or immoral in any sense.
Yeah, I like what you're saying, that you can still be a hypocrite and still disagree that with the principle of something and point it out, and the point you're making is not any less valid, based upon your hypocrisy or anything like that. I just dislike the and it's such a liberal thing for him to say, like, well, just my loyalty is to the republic, to democracy, as Obi-Wan would say. And it's just like, this democracy is the sacred cow of these people. It's like, no, like, when you define it, like, I would flip it back on him and say, articulate what democracy actually is, and tell me that it sounds, when you articulate it, other than just saying that it's good, that it is good, that it is moral, moral way to govern people. And it's like, yeah, democracy is literally 51% of the people deciding that the other 49% can go pound sand. Like, that's what it is at its bare minimum. And it doesn't always play out that way, but in general, that is the base cornerstone feature of the democracy. And then he implies that there's no other good alternatives to it. And like, you and I, he's obviously trying to say that like anarchists and libertarians that want to be like, well, just replace it with nothing, like, we can't articulate how that would all work. And you did a good job kind of referring to people that have pointed out how it would work. And we have anarchy in lots of different areas of our life. And it's not like anarchy like in the Fallout sense, where you got like raiders roaming around. It's people voluntarily choosing to associate or not associate with someone. There is anarchy in the automobile repair market, where if I go to a car mechanic and I want to get something fixed, like, he and I negotiate, and I pay him or I don't pay him. And if he does a good job, then I recommend him and I go back to him, or I choose to go to someone else if he did a bad job. Like, that's anarchy. That's voluntarist, like, decision making in the real world. And we make that millions of times every year. Like, those types of decisions play out, but we don't think of it because it's just the way that the world works in our minds. It's just so natural. And that's why people argue that anarchy is actually just naturalism. It's just the thing that most comes easily, because it's just us living our lives. But I want to address that. It's like, there are other systems of government that the school books and textbooks have said are immoral, and we discount them as immoral, but they can be articulated as better than democracy. Like we talked about, I think, on the last episode, like monarchy, right? Like, and he would say, he's like, well, really, you'd want to go back to the Middle Ages and live in a monarchy? But like, no, I'd like to go live in Liechtenstein of modern day monarchy, that everyone is happy, everyone is really rich, that there's basically a benevolent dictator in a sense, but he allows people to secede if they want to, but no one ever secedes from the country. So like, that's a modern day example. You've also got Singapore, which, I mean, you could have your opinions on the drug laws and the benevolent dictator there as well, but like, those are systems and countries that are prospering, that are different than democracy. And that I think you could, I'm not personally doing this, but like, you could make arguments for them being better than mob rule. And for him to say this is just kind of snarky and midwit-y.
Yeah, and let me suggest maybe what democracy should be replaced with in some instances. How about republicanism? Because we clearly don't live in a democracy in the United States. And if you think democracy is so great, then you should be advocating for everything to be as democratic as possible. You should be arguing for every company to go public. You should be arguing for every institution of government and every law and every regulation to be voted on by the entire population. Because one of the examples Michael Malice always gives is, even in the most democratic form of a meeting, which would be a town hall, you still have people organizing it, people speaking it, people cutting other people off, allowing certain rules. You still have hierarchy that is non-democratic. So the most democratic kind of meeting you can have is only successful because of the non-democratic elements to it. So clearly, democracy is not a one-size-fits-all scenario. Now, you can argue that democratic elements can help certain aspect. And I think in specific subsets, usually ones that are voluntary, democratic options and democratic influences can be helpful. I think, for instance, that some companies can run well when there are democratic elements in certain aspects. Certainly not all of them, but even if that's a democratic element amongst founders saying, "Hey, which direction should we go with this?" and then letting the 5 different founders all have a vote, and then you choose that direction and you all agree as team players. But even that's within constraints and limited options and things. But to just claim that democracy isn't mob rule when it's in our sort of current government form, when it's non-voluntary democracy and that's just this unmitigated good, well, then you need to probably defend it in its purest context and need to be advocating for the abolition of any sort of Republican elements that are in our current government. And frankly, the most disgusting thing is that this means that you probably have to defend the I can't remember, I always forget if it was the 16th or 17th Amendment. I always get those two confused. One was income tax, and the other was the direct election of senators rather than from the House of Representatives. He would have to argue that that's been a good thing, and I just clearly think it has not been a good thing. Those two things have been pretty bad for our country.
Yeah.
So if you're, sure, we'll come up with systems that we answer back. But if you think that democracy isn't mob rule and is lauded and should be more popular and adopted than it currently is, can't wait to see you advocating for the removal of the House of Representatives and the Senate and the presidency, frankly, and just have everything being run through a popular vote.
All right, let's move on to our next one. We've got Dave Smith replying to Larry Sharp, who has been on our podcast before. Larry writes, "If we can agree 80% of the time, I want you as an ally because I can't turn you if I can't discuss the 20% we don't agree on. I need you to really hear me." And he's got a picture of him as a quote saying, "If we agree 80% of the time, I consider you an ally and we can work together." And then Dave Smith comments on this saying, "The flaw with the 80-20 rule is that some issues are deal breakers. For example, you could be great on everything except lockdowns, and in 2020, an anti-lockdown right-winger would be a better ally. Today, for me, the war in Ukraine is that issue, and the classical liberal caucus is supporting it." What do you think about Dave Smith's thought on the 80-20 rule?
Yeah, it's interesting. I kind of struggle and go back because dispositionally, I'm very Larry Sharp-pilled in that way. But I think that Dave is correct here. Yeah, I do think Dave is correct here in that the way that I was trying to think about it is, well, if you agree 80% of the time, can you, it depends on how you define that 80%, I guess, because in order to agree with 80% of things, you at least have to have some kind of epistemological agreement, I think, in order how you perceive the world. And so to me, I almost wonder if, disagreeing on something like Ukraine is an epistemological issue. But then again, I also don't know if if I agree with Dave that Ukraine is a deal breaker in the sense that I think I still would consider someone in the classical liberal caucus overall an ally, depending on their framing of some things, and even if we disagree on Ukraine, but it depends on the context in which I consider them an ally. So, for instance, if I'm talking about state politics and we disagree on Ukraine, that doesn't affect it, right? Then we are really allies and we can work on things together to make the state a better place when it has nothing to do with Ukraine. When it comes to, if you're talking about a foreign relations council, then maybe it's a different matter. I don't know. I think it depends on a lot of terms of how you're defining things, how you're interpreting, and what capacities you're working with someone. I think
that it's almost that if you disagree on 20% of something with someone, like the example Dave gives about lockdowns, like how someone thinks about lockdowns means that the reason we both agree on the 80% that we agree on might not be for the same reasons. And kind of get at the epistemological thing that you were talking about earlier, like that, it almost matters more not which 80% you agree on, but why you agree on that 80%. In the first place. And like, because you could have, I don't know, like someone could with Ukraine, and it's like a fun and interesting example. Like I could actually disagree with someone on Ukraine, and my reason for disagreeing with them on Ukraine is the same reason they have for disagreeing with me on it. For example, They're like, oh, well, Ukraine is their homeland. They deserve to be free. Everyone has agency, liberty, all that good stuff. And my thing is like, well, I just think that our involvement over there has made it harder for them to have liberty, and therefore, so we're arguing for the same outcome and disagreeing about how we get there.
Right.
I think that Dave Smith properly perceives the world and the current environment that we're in, at least in the Libertarian Party and then politics in general, that there are quote unquote allies that agree with us on certain line items, but the reason it's not predictable why they agree on that. So like the next day it could be the same sort of topic, but because the principle is not there for them, we're actually going to disagree. And that person is not a reliable ally, I guess is maybe the way to put it.
Yeah.
And then I think Ukraine, where that would become something that I could, in that example I was giving earlier, is if we were now debating about whether we should send myself or someone I know or my kid over to fight in Ukraine against Russia.
Right.
Then suddenly it's like, yeah, that is a big deal breaker. Like, I don't think we, even if we have the same reasons for believing what we're going to believe, like there's a chance that like we don't view this certain aspect of how it affects each of us the same way. And that becomes something that I would probably split with someone over, because they're now trying to force their will upon me. And I guess for libertarians, that is the underlying thing that when you look at the 80%, that is the most important thing that drives it are someone trying to force their will upon you or someone else? And if that's the primary reason for why you believe one of these things in that 80%, then chances are we're going to agree on a lot. And the 20% that we disagree on, we're going to be disagreeing from the same principled standpoint.
Yeah. I think that's the heart of the issue. I maybe I'm just being a little too neurotic or something, but to me, it always I always think, what do you mean by ally, and what capacity are we talking? Because, for instance, I'm thinking about, if let's say, I'm in Congress and I do not support sending money and weapons to Ukraine, and my same party member, say we're both in the Republican Party here, and my desk mate won over, who's also a Republican, does support sending money to Ukraine and arming them, and our reasoning is both because we want safety and prosperity. I don't like that Ukraine's, being invaded by Putin, but I think our involvement is what's caused it. He doesn't want Ukraine to have to cede the territory, and thinks that by pushing back Putin, we're stopping his aggression. Okay. So we kind of have the same end objective. We think about it completely differently. But how we get there is completely different. I have kids. I don't want to send them to war. We're completely diametrically opposed in those ways. And so I'm very opposite of him in many ways. But then a bill comes up that talks about, should we track the money that we're sending to Ukraine? Well, of course I'm going to support that. I don't support sending money to Ukraine, but if we're sending money, let's keep a track of every dollar we spend and know how it's being done. One, so that we can say, was this a success in the future, which it won't be. And two, so we're not paying off slush funds for prominent politicians with the last name Biden or something like that. And we can both be allies in that moment and vote for it. Even if we have opposite policies on the objectives of Ukraine there, we can both be allies in that moment and work together to get that done. And so to me, I guess the question is, in what capacity are we talking ally? And when it comes to the heart of those issues, I mean, I would say that probably in many ways, someone like Jimmy Dore and Dave Smith actually have the same policy outcomes in a lot of areas, and they have the same strategy and the same reasoning. They have the same strategy, but then they have completely opposite reasoning to get there. But even when they have those, they could be allies on that issue and in those moments. So, would Dave Smith consider Jimmy Dore an ally? Maybe with an asterisk, but I guess it depends on how you're defining this. And if you're talking within libertarian circles and as a libertarian party, then I think I agree with Dave more, because as you articulated, how you get there and the epistemology is really what a political party should be about. It shouldn't just be this pragmatic, sell yourself out at any cost to get your guy with the letter in office.
The party exists to get votes, as they would say.
Yeah, which of course is totally stupid, because what's the point of a party to get votes if you don't actually believe in anything? If there's no meaning,
especially if there's zero chance of you winning. It's
Yeah. So I think if you're talking in a political party context and you're saying I consider you an ally, and meaning we can work together within this political party, then I completely agree with Dave. It'd be like, it'd be kind of like forming the pro-life party and then saying, well, we agree on 90% of things, but we don't agree on abortion. And then it's like, well, why are you part of I'm not going to consider you an ally to the pro-life party if we don't agree on the issue that the party is formed after. So I think Dave's right. If you're talking in that context, I think the term ally is just a little broad, nebulous, and not defined.
Yeah. All right, moving on to our next one. We've got Rand Paul referring to Anthony Fauci for investigation. And is this a quote or is he? This is a quote.
From an article. Yeah, it's quoting him, and then it will be article in and out.
Okay. There's probably never been a government official caught more red-handed lying to us, Paul said. He has proved the lie in his own words. So at first he kind of acted like, oh, we don't have anything to do with the research over there. We don't fund the research in Wuhan. So we found the actual scientific papers. We found the grant number proving it came from his agency. And then he said, oh, well, we're funding it, but it's not gain of function. My experts up and down have looked at this and it's not gain of function. We have contemporaneous documents from February of 2020 in the height of the beginning of the pandemic, where he is saying privately, we're suspicious that this virus could have come from the lab because they're doing gain of function research. He describes the projects that I had described to him a year later, which he said, oh, there's nothing to see here. We have in his own words admitting it was gain of function, admitting they funded it, and admitting it gave them suspicions of the possibility this pandemic came from the lab. We have him dead to rights. The problem is this. We have Merrick Garland, who I think is a pure rank partisan. I don't think he'll ever be prosecuted. We also have a Democrat Party that is happy to have paid him more than the president, more than any president makes, and he actually got $1 million from a private foundation while he was still a public servant. Everything about this is rotten to the core, and if we don't bring him to justice, we'll never get control we need on this type of research to try and prevent it from happening again.
So I think Rand Paul is just once again proving that he is incredible here. One, he highlights directly all of the things. I mean, I was a little iffy on Rand. I always felt like during the Trump years, because it felt like he was appeasing Trump in certain ways, and I didn't love that. And he, voted for Jeff Sessions as Attorney General, and I was always like, oh, what'd you do that for? He has more than made up. Like, if not that he owes me an apology, but if he was trying to apologize and bring me flowers as reconciliation, his whole string with Anthony Fauci over the last years has been that tenfold over. And I am so glad that even though, I'm glad on so many dimensions. One, I'm glad that he did it. I'm glad that he highlighted during the height of everyone being locked down that what was done was wrong, and that the guy who was leading the charge had no credible evidence for it and was responsible for it. Two, I'm glad that not only that, he's following up and actually trying to make those hearings result in something. Because one of the charges I always got about when I would hype those up or talk about even Rand in other contexts was, oh, he's just grandstanding. He's just trying to do it for fundraising. Well, maybe, but he's actually trying to get a consequence from that. So you can argue it's for fundraising, but it doesn't matter because the intended effect is at least being attempted, which is to bring him to prosecution and to stop it from ever happening again. And third dimension is that he also isn't doing this in a naive way where he says, we're going to write a strongly worded letter. He's like, look, I don't think it's going to happen because of the bogus system that's around. And that's a problem. So I love this take because one, he does his homework. He shows the trail of evidence. Two, he has a call to action and actually tries to get something done that would punish and prohibit this kind of thing from happening again in the future. And three, he's not rose-colored lens looking through it. He's not pretending, to pretty up for the donor base or for the red meat to say, we're going to get Fauci and then nothing's going to happen. He recognizes the reality of the situation, even if it's sad or disappointing. Just an absolutely brilliant take from Rand here.
Yeah, Rand... just tons of courage, right? Like if he had just come out, I'm assuming this is an article from just recently.
Yeah, yes, it is.
There's a bit of the public sentiment towards Fauci has soured, now that a lot of people have come around to realize these things don't work. But the thing is, Rand Paul was giving it to Fauci back when Fauci was at the peak of his popularity. So very courageous and awesome effort. He was always, a lot of these Senate hearings and things like, it's almost like the senators that are doing the, conducting them get a list of talking points and sound bites that their aides want them to get in. And so they're not super prepared, and it sometimes leads to super embarrassing and revealing moments where they get caught on their own thing. I'm trying to remember the Facebook hearings.
Oh no!
But like one of the Republican senators just like clearly had no idea how Facebook or any of this technology worked. Like at
Does
a base
Facebook
level,
access, or I was thinking of the TikTok. Does TikTok access your Wi-Fi?
yeah, or something like that. Man, it was just so embarrassing and bad.
All of them were.
But Rand Paul is fantastic in that he, one, is a doctor, two, always came very, very prepared and had a strategy for dealing with Fauci as a known liar. So he would word his questions in a way that forced Fauci to commit to things, things that he should have committed to, not like being tricky or anything, but like forced him to commit to things that he couldn't, that he would either have to double back on later and be obvious about it, or just like stick with his guns and tell the truth. And he always double backed and lied and made a fool of himself. And I'm thankful that even after Fauci is out of his position, that Rand Paul is still continuing to go after him, and he just does such a fantastic job laying this out. Like I didn't know that we had documents that referred to Fauci talking about and speculating that the pandemic came from the lab in Wuhan. Like I had no idea those words actually came out of his mouth, and that's. I mean, I already knew that he knew that because of just all of the surrounding evidence and just the documentation. But the fact that it came from his exact mouth, and then a year and a half later, he was, kind of, discrediting it and discrediting people that parroted that because of his political affiliations. I mean, just makes it all the much more worse.
I'm. Let's be honest and let's be fair. Dr. Fauci didn't lie in every response he gave to Rand. For instance, he did say, I'm not required to disclose if anyone or myself was paid money by private entities during this. He didn't. So that wasn't a lie. He just, backed into a corner saying, I don't have to tell you, when asked a very critical question about a conflict of interest with money. I mean, it's like saying, hey, this person was shot with an AR-15 bullet. Do you own an AR-15? I'm not required to answer that question. It's like, well, technically no, but it doesn't make you look very good when you say
your
that.
Non-answer is indicative of what the actual answer is.
Yeah, it's pretty scary that you would answer that way. But yeah, I mean, it was crazy because in real time you could watch these hearings. You could watch the last one that took place and then the current one that was taking place and see Fauci literally double back on himself. He would say, no, you have to double mask. And then he would say, well, no, double masking was just a suggestion. It was never seriously recommended. This absolutely was not a lab leak. It never would be a lab leak. Well, okay, we never totally discounted the lab leak theory. We never said that we just said it was unlikely. It's like you could hear him lying in real time if you just watched the last one. And Rand not only was good at pressing him in the most important questions, like you highlighted, he was good at following up the next time to catch him in these lies. And I knew people I'm close with who I like and admire, who literally during 2020 would be pushing things. And I remember having a conversation with another person who I greatly respect and admire. For everyone's sake, I'm keeping it a little vague and anonymous here. But this person I admire and respect, who's great, was being very fair about sort of COVID. He was more skeptical like I was, and saying things like, man, I wish there was a consensus, and I wish there was, certainty and like an authority who knew everything about this, because it was very early in 2020.
Yeah.
And this other person who I like responded saying, we do, and his name is Anthony Fauci. And it takes everything in me not to hit that person up and say, hey, remember how you said that this person was the sole authority on it? Yeah, he lied here, and here. And I don't want to be that person. I don't want to stir those up unnecessarily. But it makes me mad because people bought into the Fauciism so hard. The cult of him was crazy. And now I think Rand is hopefully toppling his tower down, and as he rightfully should.
Yep. All right. Our last take is a video with Sam Harrison. We'll play that here now.
Dial up the deadliness of the pathogen. Give us something like, airborne Ebola that incubates for a month. You don't know you have it, and you walk around spreading it, and it's got, a 75% fatality rate, and it's mostly killing kids. No one gets to make that choice anymore. I mean, then literally the cops come in and vaccinate you. And I would say that all of us would agree to that. The moment, again, that you turn up the lethality on the pathogen, you turn up the effectiveness of the vaccine, you turn down the risk of the vaccine. Give me a truly safe vaccine where there's not even one documented case of vaccine injury, right? So that then you just have to be completely crazy to be worried about being vaccinated in that kind of environment. Then it's just a no-brainer. Then we just don't tolerate a diversity of opinion because the stakes are too high. It's a full-on emergency. Bodies of kids are being stacked up in parks, right? There's so many of them, we don't know what to do with them. We've got these mobile morgues, and we have a vaccine that actually works. And then we've got RFK Jr. saying, maybe you don't want, maybe you don't want to get the jab on Rogan's podcast, right? That's the world I've been worried about ever since COVID.
Okay.
Oh my gosh.
There's so many things I want to say on this. First and foremost, piles of dead kids in the parks. That sounds like that'd be something that would excite Sam Harris based on his takes about finding dead kids in the basement of in Hunter Biden's basement and not caring and still pulling the trigger for Biden. So I don't think that saying dead kids is a really big issue for him. No, I really liked Dave Smith's tweet on this, which I didn't include here, but I'll read. He says, quote, "Imagine if everything was completely different, then things would be different. Imagine if COVID had a 100% death rate and the vaccine was perfectly safe. RFK looks pretty stupid now." Sam Harris on his international humiliation tour. Yes. I mean, what an absurd thing to say. Like, that's my favorite debate tactic, just completely change the scenario to a point of absurdity. I was watching a debate on abortion with Trent Horn and Destiny the other day, and one of the things is they kept bringing sort of hypotheticals to each other. And one thing that Trent Horn pointed out, which I really liked, is that hypotheticals and scenarios and examples that you're trying to make analogies for, they're not going to be one-to-one. But some hypotheticals are much closer to reality than others, and you have to factor that when you weigh these things out. So when Sam Harris says all of these things and he's changing the fundamental issues, one, that's not the reality we lived in, and two, even in that reality, the way that people respond would be different, and it's are there going to be holdouts? Sure, that's fine, but you would have enough voluntary cooperation from people that if people refuse to vaccinate, then businesses would voluntarily enact mandates to make sure that those people wouldn't come in. People would voluntarily go out in minimal ways and not risk exposure. There would be adjustments. It's as stupid as saying, well, if I were to say, yeah, oh, okay, well, imagine if forest fires or the fire that burned that beautiful city on Maui right now, imagine that didn't destroy buildings, and imagine that it was not lethal at all, and that when the fire went away, everything was totally fine. Well, people wouldn't evacuate then, and that's a problem. I mean, like, it's that level of absurd to just deny the stark reality in front of you and then say, take your moral high ground based on this hypothetical that is completely contrary to the actual issues people have. It's like, oh, I'm not friends with Britt because he's mean. Now imagine Britt's not mean. Well, now you have no reason to not be friends with him. Yeah, because the issue I gave was the problem. Like, what a stupid thing to do. Sam Harris has become even more of a joke of a human being, and frankly, I feel so vindicated. Because the years, Christians were seen to, oh, look how dumb you guys are. Look at this brilliant atheist taking all you down. I never thought he was that great to begin with. And I'm just like, yeah, okay, this is your guy. This is your champion. Okay. All right. You own him. Take him.
I always found his, I don't know if you ever listened to his podcast with Jordan Peterson, the two ones where they try to suss out truth. I just found him so insufferably, I realize I sound silly saying this because I'm not a neuroscientist or anything, but I found him insufferably dumb and pedantic when he was arguing with Jordan Peterson. Like, he could clearly, it's like, dude, you just understand that he has a different viewpoint than you on what constitutes truth. It's very pragmatic. And just because you don't agree with it doesn't mean you don't understand it or you can't understand it. I mean, he always approaches from that. And that was a signal that eventually this type of behavior and argumentation was going to come from him. His remarks here remind me. Do you ever watch Napoleon Dynamite?
Movie? Oh yeah.
Okay, yeah. Uncle Rico talking with Napoleon about like, he's like, whatever summer of or football season of 72, it was the game championship and I hadn't played all season. But if coach had put me in as the quarterback, I would have thrown the game-winning touchdown. And if I had thrown that game-winning touchdown, I would have gone to college and been, number one. And then I would have been, in the NFL and I'd be super rich and things would be different now. And it's just like, yeah, you're right. Like if all of that happened, things would be different now. Just like your Dave Smith quote, like if things were different, then yes, things would have been different.
Yeah.
I think you and I actually gave this exact example early on in the pandemic. We said, look, even if you had airborne Ebola, you would still not need to mandate vaccination. It would still not be right to do that because you and I would get the vaccination because the calculus of whether it was worth it or not would outweigh the risks of taking it. So it's or getting Ebola at least. So his examples are so funny and like not interesting, but interesting in the way that he's like, you wouldn't have RFK saying this on Joe Rogan's podcast. It wouldn't be tolerated. It's like, you're right. It wouldn't be tolerated. But when have we seen the example that you're saying occur? When has that actually ever occurred? It has not happened like that yet. And hopefully it never does happen like that because a lot of people would be dead. But it just shows that he contains so much hate and bitterness and anger in his heart towards people of a certain type of ideology or that he believes, that they have a certain type of ideology. So like he'll just go through all these great lengths to invent a fictional scenario to dunk on these fictional people that would do these fictional actions in this fictional world that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Like it's just his hatred is just full on display there. I mean, it looks like it's just him being dumb, but it really is him he just despises people that don't think like him. That's so much for the tolerant atheist,
Yeah. No, I want to steelman him as much as I can because, well, one, I've spent a lot of time talking, and I'm sure I've give dumb examples before, and I've said stupid things, and people can take me out of context and highlight my idiocy. That's fine, whatever. Let's say that the point I think he's trying to make here is that I think the RFK thing actually throws this off because I think when you throw in RFK, you're talking about someone who's citing data and statistics and real world effective knowledge with what is. And I think that that's not the main point he started to make. And then he kind of closed that like in reflective, like he almost couldn't help himself, like savoring at the thought. What I think he was trying to, and he hints at it, is, we wouldn't tolerate that as a society. We wouldn't care about diversity of opinion. That to me is actually the most compelling point, which is to say, okay, so the principles that people are saying, like you or I, is that lockdowns were wrong, not only because COVID was not the level of mortality and the level of destruction, but because it's wrong to lock people down ethically, and you need to let people have a diversity of opinions even if they're wrong, and etc. So he brings in RFK at the end because RFK is one of those voices of dissent. But what's interesting is maybe the idea of saying, okay, let's suppose we have a vaccine, and this is clearly not what happened. Let's say we have a vaccine with perfect level of efficacy, and let's say we have an airborne of Ebola. Society would not tolerate the idea of a diversity of opinions and allowing people to have vaccine. And to that, I think our response is clear, which is no, actually we would. It still would be right to not physically harm people because private people would come together and make those rules voluntarily without government coercion. Because, for instance, I think that it would be a reasonable thing to say, if you have this very deadly disease that is 100% communicable and there's a way to get that treated, then you walking is a violation of other people's rights when, like, I own a business and you walk in here. And so for me, as if I were a business owner that owned a physical location like that, I would voluntarily put that, because it's not a matter of locking someone out of their free choice. It's that there is a widely available option, and I don't want to put you at risk to other customers. And that's a reasonable thing to think in a scenario like that. So I think we actually do value diversity of a thought and opinion, because there's a chance that we're wrong. Because the other aspect of this is that, sure, that is a likely scenario when you pitch it as the reality. But when you're pitching that as the reality, you've already predetermined that outcome. And so you're never going to have a scenario where you say, now let's say there's a airborne Ebola with 100% vaccine, and there's these dissenters who say it's not totally safe. There's no reality in which when you set that scenario up, the dissenters are right, because you've already set the scenario up. But life is never that sure. We can never actually be sure. And people thought that that's what COVID was. So in his example here, he almost shows the point that that's the assumption people already made about COVID, and they were wrong. And so, not valuing the dissenting voices proved to be a huge mistake. So in a way, I think he undermines his own argument because he sets up a fake scenario with 100% guaranteed surety saying we would abandon those principles, rightly so. And then you look on reality and say, oh, everyone thought that the reality scenario was the hypothetical that Sam just brought up. And therefore, we didn't value those voices and we paid the price for it. So frankly, I think Sam, not only, even if you take him at his best, I think it actually makes it completely a worse point for him if you were to hash everything out and look at his hypothetical with reality.
Yeah, well said. I don't have much more to add to it unless you do.
Nope. Just, again, don't. If you've ever looked up to Sam Harris, maybe reevaluate. We're always welcome to people who've changed their minds. I've changed my minds on a lot of things. And when people make themselves buffoons, you have to reevaluate. I've had to do that for a couple of people I've admired too. So
Awesome. Well, friends, thanks for hanging out with us for this show. And we'll catch you on the next one.
Take care.